Thank you all for a wonderful first half. You guys were brilliant. I'm just saying, wow, like what an amazing sound. It was a wonderful first half, so thank you very, very much. We opened our slot there with a piece called Trailblaze by Goff Richards again. Goff Richards is a theme that will keep coming back. And that's because he's one of the best brass band arrangers, composers that has lived. He took it from a place where we were playing orchestral transcriptions to where we had original brass band music that was our own. And so we could start with our own pieces and celebrate themed brass bands. So that was a brilliant start there from Trailblaze by Goff Richards. And we're going to move on quite a lot. So to a 2008 piece, very, very different. This is a piece of music simply played in a tango style. But it wasn't a tango originally. So this is Poker Face by Lady Gaga. To evoke the silence and stillness of midnight, where the only things that move are wheelie bins, apparently. So going to the music group anyway. So we're going to play a wonderful, wonderful solo, and we're going to feature our principal euphonium player, Seb. And it's a pleasure. Another Goff Richards piece. This is a piece called Midnight Euphonium. Welcome, Seb. Another round of applause for Seb, please. Brass bands often play overtures from different orchestras and things like that. This is one of my favourite overtures. I think it's one of the most magical musicals that you'll ever see, particularly if you take any young people with you. I think it's just unbelievable as a spectacle. So we're going to play something now. The words and music, Elton John and Tim Rice, and the orchestral music is by Hans Zimmer. And so this is The Lion King. We're going to move on to change the mood a lot. We're going to play the most beautiful hymn setting, and this is a hymn entitled Manchester. So we'll play the hymn Manchester. We're going to move on, and we're going to play a piece of music that was made famous by the Mamas and Papas. It's reached loads of things. It was released in 1963 and again in 1965. It's a real great thing to show the California sound. It got into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 2001, and this is California Dreamin. Okay, so we're going to play another piece now by The Killers. So this is from 2004. Some of the band said, if you put this piece tonight, Matt, then we're going to be very, very angry. And this particular person arrived very early today to help set up. And so I know that Spike as well, but I know that Amy helped set up all of this to the point that Leslie said, please have a Coke, because like, we look really, really tired. So if I could just say a massive thank you to Amy for coming early to set up and give her a round of applause. And this is Somebody Told Me. So we come on to our final piece. Then what will happen, there'll be a very quick change on the stage. So the chairs are going to be stacked up and go to the side, and then both bands are going to come together to play a joint piece. So you'll just need to bear with us for a few minutes while we do that. So our final piece that we're going to play is a very, very famous but very, very cheesy piece. It was released in 1986, and it was the first #1 for the Bangles. And so this is Walk Like an Egyptian. trombones. First of all, I want to say a massive thank you to you guys for being a brilliant audience. As always, the club for putting us on. Really, really appreciate it. Leslie's been here since Friday and still here, checking that I'm okay. So that's brilliant. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you. Frank mentioned earlier about Even. So Even first sent me a message, I just checked on my phone, in September 2024 to start putting this in motion. So he's been working hard, and I know you'd already spoken to Phil and the people as well, so he's been working on this for over a year, which is absolutely brilliant. We've not actually spoken until today. We've got lots of messages, and even seems to visit Manchester more than me. Because he keeps saying, I'm in Manchester today. I'm like, I'm not, I'm really sorry. So it's been an absolute pleasure to get to meet you and to hear your wonderful band. We've absolutely loved it. So a massive thank you to you guys. And as a token of our appreciation, we've got a lovely, the first one of the, you can have a banner. So we talked about this earlier. So even Frank, if you want to come and collect our we'll do that. So, give them a round.
He said what? How old is he? I give him a Wi-Fi. How old is he?
13. 13.
So, even sent me a piece of music to play, and then when he got here, I said, it's great if you wanted to conduct it. He said, no, you could conduct it, which is brilliant. So we had a rehearsal upstairs at 20 to 6. Scary, the people that come from Switzerland managed to get here early, and the people down the road didn't. So lots of people were. So it's a brilliant piece of music, actually. You can find a recording of it on YouTube. There's this random guy who's in his garden, and he might be the composer, I don't know, they might not be that random, he's actually thinking about it. But he's sat in his garden, and then he's got some headphones on, and somebody comes along and says, listen to this piece, and then they like go walking and listen to this piece. So it's got a tune that you'll be whistling for the rest of the week, I can promise you that. So this is the Middlewood Festival, and thank you to our wonderful guests from Switzerland. We've absolutely enjoyed every minute with you. We hope that you have a wonderful time here. Look at Castle Shore this week, so that's been refurbished, very nice. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you soon. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Even now. Okay, you guys. Bar 32. Bar 32. Okay, bar 32.
About 32. 32. 32.